Page 6. Are you gonna read it, or where are you eating? Otello disappeared into the shadow near the place where George lay pinned to the ground by the spade. Miss Maple did not keep watch herself. She stood by the water, though, trying to wash the traces of blood off of her nose. The rest of the sheep acted naturally. A little later, Tom O'Malley, no longer entirely sober, came along the footpath to Glenfield to favor the local pub with his custom. The fresh air did him good. The green grass, the blue sky. Gulls pursued their prey, calling, wheeling in the air so fast that it made his head spin. George's sheep were grazing peacefully. Picturette, like a travel brochure. One sheep had ventured particularly far out and was enthroned like a small little lion on the cliff itself. "Hey there, little sheep," said Tom. "Don't you take a tumble now. It would be a shame for a pretty little thing like you to fall." The sheep looked at him with disdain, and he suddenly felt stupid and drunk. But that was all in the past now. He'd make something of himself. In the tourism line, that was it. The future of Glenkill lay in the tourism track. He must go and talk to cover with the lads in the pub. But first he wants to take a closer look at the fine black ram. 4 horns, unusual that. George's sheep were something special. However, the black ram wouldn't let him close enough, and easily avoided Tom's hand without even moving much. Then Tom saw the spade. A good spade. He could do with a spade like that. He decided to consider it his spade in future, but now he'd hide it under the dolmen and come back to fetch it after dark. He didn't much like the dig of going to the dolmen by night. People told tales about it, but it was a modern man. And this was an excellent spade. When he grasped the handle, his foot stuck something soft. It was a long time since Tom O'Malley had attracted such an attentive audience in the mad bore as he did that afternoon. Soon after, Heather saw a small group of humans running along the path from the village. And Otello emerged rather quickly from under the dolmen. The group was led by a very thin man whom the sheep didn't know. They looked hard at him. The leader of the flock is always important. Behind him came the butcher. The sheep held their breath. Even the scent of him was enough to make any sheep go weak at the knees. The butcher smelled of death, of screams, pain, and blood. The dogs themselves were afraid of him, and the sheep hated the butcher, and they loved Gabrielle, who came right after him. Small man with a shaggy beard and a hat, walking fast to keep up with the mountain of flesh just ahead. They knew that they hated the butcher. They didn't know why they loved Gabriel. His dogs could do the most amazing tricks. He won the shepherd dog trials in Goriel every year. It was said he could talk to the animals, but that wasn't true. At least the sheep didn't understand what Gabriel spoke. But they felt touched, flattered, and finally seduced into trotting trustfully up to him when he passed their meadow, so this way along the path through the fields. Now the humans had almost reached the corpse. The sheep forgot about looking natural for a moment and craned their necks to see. The thin man leaned. The human stopped. Several lambs leaped away from George as if rooted to the ground. His tall figure swamped for a moment like a branch in the wind, but his eyes were fixed, sharp as pins, on the spot where the spade stuck out of George's guts. Gabriel and the butcher stopped a little away from the body, too. The butcher looked at the ground for a moment. Gabriel took his hands out of his trouser pockets. The thin man removed his cap. Otello boldly grazed way past them. Then, puffing and panting, her face scarlet and her red hair all untidy, Lily came along the path too, and with her a cloud of artificial lilac perfume. When she saw George, she uttered a small, sharp scream. The sheep looked at her calmly. Lily sometimes came to their meadow in the evening and uttered those short, sharp screams at the least little thing, when she trod in a pile of sheep droppings, or her skirt caught on the hedges, when George said something she didn't like. The sheep were used to it. George and Lily often disappeared and spent a little time inside the shepherd's caravan. Lily's Little shrieks didn't bother them anymore. But then the wind suddenly carried a pitiful, long, drawn-out sound across the meadow. Moppy and Cloud lost their nerve and gallivanted up the hill, where they felt ashamed of themselves and tried to look natural again. Lily fell to her knees right beside the body, ignoring the grass, which was wet with last night's rain. She was the person making this dreadful noise. Willow! Willow, stop moving the table. Like a couple of confused insects, her hands wandered over the Norwegian sweater and George's jacket and tugged at his collar. The butcher was suddenly beside her, pulling her roughly. Willow, stop moving the table. Back by her arm. The sheep held their breath. The butcher had moved as quickly as a cat. Now he said something, and Lily looked at him with tears in her eyes. She moved her lips, but not a sound was heard in the meadow. The butcher said something to reply, but then he took Lily's sleeve and drew her aside. The thin man immediately began talking to Gabriel. Othello looked around for help. If he stayed close to Gabriel, he would miss whatever was going on between the butcher and Lily, and vice versa. None of the sheep wanted to get close to the body or the butcher, which both smelled of death. They preferred to concentrate on the job of looking natural. Miss Molly came trotting along from the water through and took over observation of the butcher. There was still a suspicious red mark on her nose, but as she had been rolling in the mud, she now just looked like a very dirty sheep. Ridiculous fuss, the butcher was just saying to Lilia. Never mind making a spectacle of yourself. You got other worries now, sweetheart, believe you me. He had taken her chin in his sausage-like fingers and raised her head slightly so that she had to look straight into his eyes. Why would anyone suspect me? She asked, trying to free her hand. George and I got along fine. The butcher still held her chin in the firm grip. Get along fine, so you did. That's be enough for them. And who else got along fine with George? Wait for this last will and testament, then we'll see how fine you guys got along. I don't suspect that cosmetic in his dump either, so you be nice to old Ham, and you won't need to worry about the mess anymore. Gabriel said something. Ham turned abruptly and marched back to the others, leaving Lily where she was. She drew her shawl more closely around her shoulders, trembling. For a moment she looked as if she was going to burst into tears. Maple knew how she felt, being touched by the butcher. It must be like having death grab you by the ear. The four humans were exchanging words again, but the sheep were far too away to catch anything. There was a pointed, awkward silence. Gabriel turned and strolled back to the direction of the village, with the thin man close on the heels. Lily seemed to think for a moment and then hurried off after the two men. Ham took no notice of the others. He went right up to George. Slowly he raised one of the great butcher's paws until he was hovering directly above the body like a few blue bottle. With his fingers he traced 2 lines above George in the air. A long one from George's head to his stomach and a shorter one from shoulder to shoulder. When Gabriel called him again, he went off in the direction of the village. Later, 3 policemen came to take photos. They brought a highly perfumed woman journalist with them. She took photos too, far more photos than the policemen. She never went to the edge of the cliff and photographed Zora on her rock ledge. And later she took pictures of Richard's field and Moppy grazing in front of the dolmen. The sheep were used to the occasional attention of tourists with backpacks, but all this press interest soon made them uncomfortable. Moppy was the first to lose his nerve. He ran uphill, beating loudly. His panic infested the others, even Miss Maple and Othello. Within a few moments, they were all huddled together on the hill, feeling slightly ashamed of themselves. The policeman took no notice of the sheep. They pulled the spade out of George, wrapped both him and it in a large plastic bag, crawled back on the ground a little more, and then disappeared into the white car. Not long after that, it began to rain, and soon the meadow looked as if nothing had happened. The sheep decided to go into the hay barn. They all went together, because just now, soon after George's death, the barn seemed to them a bit gloomy and sinister. Only Miss Maple stayed outside in the rain a little longer, letting it wash letting it wash the mud off of her, and in the end it washed off the last small blood stain too. When she went into the barn, the sheep had gathered around Othello and were bombarding him with questions, but the ram was bidding his time. Heather belittled in alarm. How could you stand it? Being so close to the butcher, I would have died of fright. I almost did die of fright just watching him come down the path. Miss Maple rolled her eyes, but you had to give the back ram credit. He seemed unimpressed by the admiration of his flock. Sounding very matter-of-fact, he turned to Miss Maple. The butcher spoke first. Swine, that's what he said. The sheep looked at each other in amaze. No pigs had ever set trotter on their pasture. The butcher's remark made no sense, but Othello was very sure of himself. He smelled very angry and frightened, but mostly angry. The thin man was afraid of him. Gabriel wasn't. Othello seemed to be reflecting on Gabriel's fearlessness for a moment, and then he continued. Lily didn't say anything sensible, just, "Oh, George, and why now? And why are you doing this to me? Perhaps you didn't realize he was dead?" Then the butcher pulled her away by her arm. "No one's to touch him," he said. So when she said quite quietly, "Please, I only want a moment alone with him." None of the others said a word, only Butcher. If anyone had the right out, it'd be Kate. He sounded nasty, and then he hurled her away. I think she's going to take a nap. The sheep nodded. They themselves had to have a good view of it all. Suspicious instantly turned around the butcher. But Miss Maple shook her head impatiently, and Othello went on. The moment the butcher was far enough off, the thin man began talking to Gabriel. He smelled funny of whiskey and Guinness, but not as if he's been drinking. Most of his body and his clothes, specifically his hands. He'd done it. A very young ram with a lively imagination burst at that. He poured whiskey over his hands because he couldn't stand the smell of blood anymore. "Maybe," said Miss Maple. Maudie, who had the best sense of smell in the whole flock, shook her head. Human beings don't scent blood the way we do. They can't really scent anything at all. Oh, someone's pulling up. Yeah, someone's pulling up. To be continued. To continue. "We don't know whether the murderer had blood-stained hands or not," said Miss Maple. "We don't know anything much." She looked at Othello. Then the thin man told Gabriel very quietly, "You still had so much he was going to do. His head was full of crazy plans. I don't suppose anything will come of them now, do you?" He spoke very fast, so fast I couldn't remember it all at one go. He kept on talking about George's plans. I think he wanted to warn something out of Gabriel, but Gabriel didn't reply. Othello put his head thoughtfully on one side. I'd say the thin man annoyed him. That's why Gabriel called the butcher back. When the butcher came closer, the thin man immediately stopped talking. Then they all started up again at the same time. Lily said something. Someone ought to tell his wife. Gabriel said, someone ought to fetch the police. And the butcher said he'll stay with him till they come. Then the thin man said quickly, "No one's staying here alone." The other men stared at the butcher the way they were stare another ram down before duel. The butcher went very red in the face, but then he nodded. Miss Maple started to collect questions. She told all the sheep to say what they didn't understand, that they'd like to know. She stood in the middle of the flock with Mopple, the whale, beside her, and when she thought a question was worth remembering, she looked at Mopple and nodded. And the stout ram memorized the question. Once Mopple had memorized something, they never forgot it. "Why did they take photographs of us?" said Maudie. "Why did it rain?" said Cloud. "Why did George come to the meadow in the night?" asked Heather. Maple nodded at Mopple. Heather glanced proudly at Othello. "Why did the butcher come here?" said Maudie. "Why does the butcher want from Lily?" said Othello. Miss Maple nodded. "What's a last will and testimony?" asked Lane. And Miss Maple nodded again. When will When we will, when will we be able to graze where George was laying again? Asked Cloud. Are they going to drive pigs into our pasture? Asked Maudie. Why, why use a spade? The murderer could have pushed him off the cliff, said Zora. Miss Maple nodded. What about the wolves? Asked Sarah. Will he be a danger to the lambs or us? Miss Maple hesitated for a moment, but then she gave Mopple no signal. Why doesn't someone murder the butcher? Asked Cloud. Several sheep bleated approvingly, but Miss Maple didn't nod. How long has he been laying in the meadow? Asked Mopple. The whale. Miss Maple nodded at him, and Mopple beamed. A lamb trotted forward. He had no name yet. The sheep were given names only when they had lived through their first winter. Will George's ghost come back? Asked the lamb shyly. Cloud leaned soothingly down to him and let him snuggle up to her thick fleece. No, little one, George's ghost won't come back. Human beings don't have souls. No souls, no ghosts. Simple. How can you say that? Protested Mopple. We don't know whether humans have souls or not. Every lamb knows that your soul is in your sense of smell, and human beings don't have a good nose. Maudie herself had an excellent sense of smell, and often thought about the problem of souls and noses. So you'd only see a very good small ghost, nothing to be afraid of. Otello leaned down to the lamb to amuse. But I've seen it already, bleated the lamb. It was very big, much bigger than me, and I have a very good sense of smell. It was shaggy in a dance. At first I thought it was a wolf's ghost, but now George is dead, I know it must have been him. I was so scared. I thought this morning I must have seen dreaming. Miss Maple looked keenly at the lamb. How do you know George was dead by then? I saw him. You saw George dead and didn't tell us? No, it wasn't that, the lamb said. I saw the spade, but George must have been laying underneath it. Must have he? The lamb looked thoughtfully. Or do you think he fell on top of the spade later? There was no more to be out of the lambs, who had slipped out of the barn in the night and couldn't say why. In the moonlight he had seen the spade and the shaggy wolf's ghost, and he couldn't describe it in any more detail. He was so frightened that he fell asleep at once. Now silent, Drizane, the sheep huddled closer together. The lamb buried his head deep in Cloud's fleece, while the others stared at the ground. Miss Maple sighed. 2 questions for Mopple. Who is the wolf's ghost, and where's Tess? The sheep looked at each other. Where indeed was Tessie, George's old sheepdog, his most faithful companion, the one real love of his life, the gentlest sheepdog who had ever hurdled them? When the others had gone to sleep, Miss Maple quietly added another question to the list. She told him she had told Ramses that she didn't know whether the murderer had blood-stained hands. The fact was she didn't even know whether the murderer had hands at all. She thought George's face had looked peaceful, smelling slightly of Guinness and tea. His clothes were smoky. He was holding a cup of flowers in his hands. He had struck her as a little strange, struck her as a little strange because George was not normally much interested in flowers. He had more time for vegetables. But she had found something else, and it had made her push the blood-stained Norwegian sweater up a little more with her nose. There, on George's pale stomach, slightly above the place where the spade had gone in, was the print of a sheep's hoof, a single hoof print, just the one. Dun, dun, dun. Maybe a sheep did it. Maybe our Willow did it. Chapter 2. Heather suspects something. To be continued. Willow, you want to say something? Hey. Nothing?